Great. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Olivia Erico. I'm the program manager here at the Alice Paul Institute. And thank you again for joining our virtual Lunch and Learn series, Champions of Equality. So this is a series that features conversations with activists, educators, and academics on people from the past and present who have made an impact on the fight for gender equality. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you all to join us for our land acknowledgement. So the land on which we gather at API is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape, known as Lenapehoking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed west and north, but some also remain among the continuing historical tribal communities of the region. The Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation, the Ramapo Lenape Nation, and the Powhatan Lenape Nation, the Nanticoke of Millsbury, Delaware, and the Lenape of Cheswold, Delaware. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief, Tamamend, that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. So before I introduce our guest today, I just want to remind everyone that we invite you to share your questions during the Q&A portion of this program. We are dedicated to making all our spaces, virtual and otherwise, safe and inclusive for everyone. Harassment of any kind will not be tolerated in verbal or written comments during API programs. If anyone chooses to engage in racist, sexist, transphobic, or homophobic speech, or any kind of harassment, they will be removed from the program without further warning. Thank you for being a part of our community and for partnering with us as we remain dedicated to equality for all in word and deed. So today I'm joined by Dr. Alex Ketchum, who is here to talk about her book, Ingredients for Revolution, and her research on feminist restaurants. Dr. Ketchum is an assistant professor at McGill University's Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. She is the director of the Just Feminist Tech and Scholarship Lab. From 2018 to 2013, she was the faculty lecturer at the IGSF. Her work integrates food, technology, queer, gender, and environmental history. Coinciding with the 50th anniversary of the trailblazing restaurant Mother Courage of New York City, Ketchum's second book, Ingredients for Revolution, A History of American Feminist Restaurants, Cafes, and Coffeehouses, is the first history of the more than 230 feminist and lesbian feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffeehouses that existed in the United States from 1972 to the present. As key sites of cultural and political significance, this volume shows the essential role these institutions served for multiple social justice movements, including women's liberation, LGBTQ equality, food justice, as well as serving for training centers for women workers and entrepreneurs. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Ketchum.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to move over to a screen share. And once I start the share, it will take one moment for the captions to start. So everyone should be able to see them now. So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited to talk to you all about my book and my research on the history of feminist restaurants, which were often run by lesbians and queer women. Please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A, and I'm really excited to chat with you all. So as you can see, the auto captions are on. Also, if you'd like to reference the slideshow, there's a tiny URL, so tinyurl.com/AlicePaul, and then my last name, Ketchum. I've also included a link to a song that I'll be talking about later in this presentation, the Brick Hut song by Mary J. Watkins. Thank you to Alice Paul Institute for this invitation, and thank you for the Lenape land acknowledgement that you made earlier. I also want to mention that I wrote most of this book in Jojoge, Montreal, on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. And it's really important that we're attentive to space and place because, as many of the feminist restaurants that I'm going to talk about in this presentation were trying to do, they're trying to create more equitable worlds, the kinds of worlds and futures they want to imagine. And when we're trying to do that work of imagining the kind of places that we want to be in, we need to be really attentive to the histories and ongoing effects of colonialism and neocolonialism. So for the organization of my talk today, I'm going to begin with definitions, then talk a bit about how the book itself was structured and what that says about the history of feminist activism, lesbian activism, queer women's activism. I've been asked to speak a bit about my methods, which I'm happy to talk about even more in the Q&A, and then share some of my key findings. So what is a feminist restaurant? As you can see on this slide, there's images of different women gathering in spaces over time. On the far left, you see some of the initial founders and folks from Bloodroot Feminist Vegetarian Restaurant, which was founded in Bridgeport, Connecticut in 1977 and still exists today, 47 years later. They just had their 47th anniversary this past spring. There's Selma and Noel, so Selma Miriam and Noel Fury of Bloodroot right next to them in the second slide from the left, as well as founders of Mother Courage from New York City, which was founded in 1972, as well as a patron of Bread and Roses from Cambridge, Massachusetts in the 1970s. So what is a feminist restaurant? Any definition is always tricky, but for the purpose of my project and when we talk about today, feminist restaurants were restaurants where the founders, owners, operators called the restaurant explicitly feminist in either the title of the restaurant, like Bloodroot Feminist Vegetarian Restaurant and Bookstore, it's very explicit. So in their title, in their advertising, and in interviews. So it's basically that the people running the space had to identify it as feminist. And I chose that way of differentiating feminist restaurants from non-feminist restaurants because I didn't want to be prescriptive in my definition. I didn't want to be that I was saying this counts, this doesn't count, because there's lots of different types of feminism. And I didn't want it to be so centered on me, but rather to understand what were the stakes of identifying a restaurant as feminist. To just kind of give a sense of feminist restaurants in popular culture, I'm also going to be speaking about cafes and coffee houses as well. We can see depictions in sometimes even in comic books, such as the Dykes to Watch Out for comic strip. So some of you might know Alice Bechdel's earlier work. And here there's references to Cafe Topaz, which was located near Mad Women Books in the comic. And this is actually a reference to Ruby's Cafe from Minneapolis, which was founded in 1985 by Mary Banneman, and was located actually down the street from Amazon Books, the original Amazon Books, not the huge online retailer that we know today. So another kind of definitional thing that I'll be talking about today is the difference between a restaurant, a cafe, a coffee house, and a bar. And a lot of times folks ask why I'm not writing specifically about lesbian bars, for example. There's a lot of amazing work on it. I recommend checking out the work of Jen Jack Giesking, as well as many others. Moby Dykes was a book that came out recently. There's quite a lot of literature on lesbian bars. But I'm looking really about places that are kind of centering food in the work that they're doing. But it's always tricky to differentiate because sometimes a cafe is really a place where you can get food, and sometimes it's a place where you just go to get coffee. Sometimes a coffee house can be a temporary space, like people are playing music, like guitar or dancing, and it's kind of a pop-up event. And sometimes it's a cafe. So for the purposes of this project, I'm really interested in this idea of kind of permanent spaces where the people running these spaces either owned the building or had a lease. It was a place that you could go to, a set address that you would show up to and be able to get food, coffee, drinks, etc. And so I'm doing that for restaurants and cafes. And then coffee houses are the kind of temporary spaces that we might kind of call pop-up events. So they might have happened in church basements, community centers, other kinds of centers, and so forth. This idea of why not bars, I already said a bit that there's already a lot of folks who write on bars. And it also tends to be kind of situated in a different history. A lot of the work when I started this research back in 2012 around kind of like lesbian bars, gay bars, queer bars, was really situated in these longer histories of how crime was defined, conflicts with police, and it's just kind of a different history than what I saw with the restaurants themselves. I was really interested in this idea of like, what are the stakes of food being involved with feminist space? Because we oftentimes see a tension between feminism, cooking in the kitchen, right? And I love to cook. I was really involved in food politics, and I kind of want to disentangle some of these relationships. But it's always tricky, right? A restaurant that serves alcohol versus a bar that serves food. So when I show you the directory later, I'll talk about how that's even trickier. So I already showed you some examples of restaurants, feminist restaurants. Here's some examples of some of the feminist coffee houses that I looked at in my research. So there's Las Hermanas in San Diego, Iowa City Women's Coffee House, the Somerville, Massachusetts Women's Coffee House, A Cup of Warmth in Mikado, Minnesota. And so these coffee houses were temporary spaces. They oftentimes were gatherings and events, but there was still kind of coffee or food served. One of the reasons I decided to look at both restaurants and coffee houses is because it also diversified the kinds of owners, founders, and operators that I was looking at. So feminist restaurants, because they required more startup capital, either to get a lease or to buy the building, were oftentimes run by middle class, sometimes lower class and working class, and sometimes upper middle class, white women and Jewish women. Because prior to the passage of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 1974, women couldn't get credit cards in their own name. It was really hard to get a loan. And even after that passage, it still was difficult for women to get bank loans. So if you're already going to be a woman, already a barrier to getting a loan, many of the people who started these spaces were lesbians, some identify as queer women now. So that's another kind of barrier, right? You're facing sexism, you're facing homophobia. And then if you're also facing racism as a woman of color, it'd be like nearly impossible to get a loan to start these restaurants. And while a lot of the restaurants actually did things that we might call kind of community fundraising or crowdsourcing today, they would host dances, they would sell memberships, they'd have different ways to get money from the community, microloans. There were still a lot of kind of barriers to creating a restaurant itself. So coffee houses actually enabled a lot more diversity in who was starting these spaces. So you had a lot more women of color involved in starting feminist coffee houses because there's less of an economic barrier to starting them. I just wanted to show a couple of examples from New Jersey because of the host for today's event, the Alice Paul Institute. And here you can kind of see a range, some restaurants, some coffee houses. And this is kind of a sample of what you can see on the directory at thefeministrestaurantproject.com. So that URL is thefeministrestaurantproject.com. And I have a list of spaces that I know for sure were feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses, and ones that might have been. And when I talk about the methods section later, I'll explain why some of them, there's kind of this uncertainty. The other part of terms that are kind of difficult to disentangle are terms like woman. So sometimes in this period that I'm looking at, especially in 1970s and 1980s, sometimes woman was a code word for lesbian. Sometimes it was trans inclusive, sometimes it was trans exclusive. It depended on the place, the time, how people were using it, right? We sometimes see like even more in contemporary times, like women with an X, sometimes it's used to be inclusive of trans identities and sometimes as exclusive. Also, lesbian could be a debated term as well as feminist. So the book itself is structured in kind of three main sections. So the permanent spaces, the restaurants, and I'm looking at the ways that the people started them, who started them, how they got the financing, what was kind of the motivation, what feminist food was. Then the temporary, the coffee houses, which allows for a greater discussion around accessibility and diversity. And then those kind of two sections are really focused from 1972 to 1989, which is really kind of the high point of feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses. And then the final part of the project is looking at after 1989 and really looking at the resurgence we see of these spaces. As I mentioned, the permanent spaces had this, like I already talked about the owners and founders of them. So the financing, as I mentioned, sometimes came from dances. Sometimes it also came from people like buying memberships to the space. And in terms of operation, a lot of the ones started early on were run by collectives. So you would see, for example, like a group of women, and especially for the 70s, it was really women. Over time, we see more of a diversity of genders, of who's involved in these spaces. The group of women who would sometimes rotate positions, they wanted to challenge restaurant hierarchies within the spaces. And so people would change roles. There were over time kind of some spaces that were run by one person, but especially for the 70s, collectives were very prominent. These restaurants were part of a larger, what I call nexus of feminist businesses. So it's a bit different than a network. So in 1976, the Boston Herald was talking about this conglomeration of feminist businesses, which they called a nexus. So that's kind of where I get this term. And what they're talking about is in the kind of Cambridge and greater Boston area, there was a feminist restaurant, Bread and Roses, there was a feminist credit union, there was a feminist bookstore, and all of them would kind of share events, they would share information about each other, and they would support each other. And feminist restaurants as a whole tended to act as these connectors within their communities. So the restaurants would serve food and provide a space for people to gather, but in the spaces, there would be political speakers, poetry readings, there'd be feminist art on the walls, women's music linked to the women's music movement playing. They would also really try to make sure to support tradeswomen in their communities. So women plumbers, women carpenters, if they could find them. There'd be bulletin boards advertising the people who worked in the space, like in terms of like if a plumber came and then they could share the card. There'd also be ways of just connecting people for roommates and so forth. But basically, these acted as kind of economic and cultural centers for sharing ideas and connecting people. The other thing feminist restaurants did is they served what they thought of as feminist food. Now, not every owner specifically thought about their food in this way, but many of the feminist restaurants were really, really explicit in how their food exemplified their feminist ideals. So we can see some really strong examples like Bloodroot, in which they produce cookbooks that are part political manifesto, part cookbook, really talking about how they define feminist food as seasonal, as vegetarian, and so forth. But generally, feminist food meant a few things. One of the kind of major things behind feminist food was trying to balance this triangle that I have on this screen. So the owners and operators wanted to make sure that farmers and kind of the producers of the raw ingredients were properly compensated. They want oftentimes for the ingredients to be local and to support kind of the local farm economy and local producer economy and fairly compensate the workers for that labor. They would also be in political solidarity with farm workers movements and with different kinds of like farm strikes. So then we have fairly compensating that labor. They also wanted to make sure that the people working within the space were fairly compensated. So they weren't using the term living wage, but that's kind of something we can see in parallel to today. This idea that people working at the restaurant would be able to pay their bills and be living their lives as out feminists and oftentimes as out lesbians. So not having to hide aspects of their identity to have employment. And that was really key, and to be fairly compensated. But the other thing that makes this really tricky, right, is they want to make sure that there are accessible prices so that people of all economic classes could come to the space. When we're thinking about the 1970s and 1980s, but even today, women make far less money than men as a whole, right? They have less disposable income and oftentimes have more care working duties, whether they're straight, they're queer, they're lesbians. And so there's just a lot less disposable income. So many of these restaurants try to have lower cost food items. But if you think about this, this is really tricky to balance, right? You're trying to make sure that people are properly compensated for their labor in terms of working in the restaurant. The farmers and producers are being properly compensated, and you're keeping prices low, right? That was really, really hard to balance. And what oftentimes happened was that the founders of these spaces just wouldn't pay themselves enough. So they're putting in lots of sweat equity and oftentimes not like actually making really any money from the restaurant. And so this oftentimes led to infighting and burnout. So that created a lot of challenges. Some spaces dealt with this by creating some items on a sliding scale or having some things like the soup of the day, or would say like, if you buy like, cheap cup of tea, you can sit here for as long as you want and you won't be bothered. But to have like different items on the menu to help compensate for all of these labor costs. The other thing that I already kind of touched on briefly was the role of vegetarianism and later veganism within feminist restaurants. So not every feminist restaurant was vegetarian, though many of them were, or at least had vegetarian food items, in part because many of the people going to them would be vegetarian. But also you have lower like food waste, right? You're not having to deal with like meat spoilage and so forth. But many of them were also eco-feminists and linked the oppression of women and the exploitation of the environment and animals together. I can talk about that more. The other ways that feminist restaurants were kind of situating themselves within these discussions of feminist food and restaurant hierarchies and labor was a move away from tipping culture. And I know the discussion of tips, especially in the context of the United States, in which there's a tipped wage, is like quite contentious for people. Though tipping has kind of a longer history tied to very racist roots within the US context. But many of the restaurants didn't want there to be tipping within them. They saw that the relationship between waiters, waitresses, wait staff, and customers created really like spaces for violence, for oppression, and they want to move away from that culture. So many of those spaces had people go to a counter and pick up their own items and then bus their own tables afterwards. But also, rather than having tipping, they would usually have a jar going to different community organizations. So here you can see actually a softball team that was sponsored by Bread and Roses, the feminist restaurant in Cambridge that I mentioned before. And you can actually see these t-shirts at the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe. So what was on the menu? So I already mentioned, right, this kind of role of food within the spaces in feminist food. Many of them often were breakfast restaurants. That was actually quite common, including Ruby's that I mentioned before that inspired some of Alison Bechdel's comics in Dykes to Watch Out For. But there is also, you would see like a wide variety of kinds of dishes. Some of the places would name dishes after feminist figures local to their community or important historic figures. So there would be like omelets named after different people. These restaurants, in addition to being sites of economic connection and cultural connection themselves, bringing together artists, activists, poets, tradespeople, they would also be sites of their own production. So they would produce pamphlets, business cards, they produce concert and event flyers, and then many of them also produce cookbooks. So here you can see at the bottom of the screen, some of the cookbooks produced by Bloodroot. The first one's The Political Palette that they wrote in 1980. They actually started their own press and they've written about 9+ cookbooks today. The co-founders of Bloodroot, some of the co-founders, also collaborated with Augusta Yearwood, who I'll talk about a bit more later, to write some later cookbooks. And Augusta then produced her own cookbook, Sweet and Salty, a couple years ago. So she's a feminist, vegan, anarchist chocolate maker with a cafe and chocolate company in New Paltz, New York, as well as in New York City. And then they also were involved with music. So I mentioned oftentimes there'd be music from the women's music movement, which was oftentimes, again, this way that woman was kind of coded as lesbian, but the women's music movement, Olivia Records was a major producer, Lady Slipper was a distributor of it. And so here we can see Mary J. Watkins and her album, Something Moving. Mary J. Watkins was produced by Olivia Records. She's actually within the space, the Brick Hut Cafe in Berkeley, California. Other musicians would work shifts at that cafe when they weren't on tour, like BBK Roche. Mary Watkins co-wrote a song about the Brick Hut Cafe, how important this space was to her, how important it was for the queer community. I'm using that term a bit anachronistically there, but for the queer community at the time. And she co-wrote the song with Pat Parker, who's a pretty famous lesbian poet and was a member of the Black Panther Party. So now to shift to temporary spaces and coffee houses. As I mentioned, they had lower overhead, so open to more folks to begin. And in these spaces, there was a lot more space for experimentation. People could really think about like how their feminist space could really embody their principles, whereas restaurants had to appeal to kind of a larger percentage of the feminist community in order to like pay their bills and operate. With lower overhead, coffee houses allowed for more experimentation. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the methods and how I got into this project. So this project began from quite a personal origin. I went to Wesleyan University for my undergrad, so it's in Middletown, Connecticut. I co-founded a living community. There's all these like houses on campus that students can like theme and run. And I started Farmhouse, which was a food politics house that still exists today. I was really involved with the school's organic farm, Long Lane, and I was taking classes in feminist studies and history. And I really wanted to bring together my interests on food politics and history and feminist activism together. And my initial research question was actually about the kinds of unremunerated, unpaid domestic food production of kind of cooking and buying ingredients and cleaning up after. And I was looking at a lot of texts written in the 1970s because there's a lot of emphasis on the role of food and how it was tied to the exploitation of women and their labor. And I was thinking a lot about wages for housework movements and so forth. But because I was so invested in food politics, I also wanted to look at the liberatory nature of food. And I thought feminist restaurants might be an example of this. A friend had mentioned Bloodroot, and I convinced someone to drive me there. And I became fascinated and started to kind of think, is this one avenue for it? It kind of is, but that actually wasn't the major finding that I found. So I ended up basically I worked on this project for about 12 years in different forms. I did my master's related to it for the Canadian ones, my PhD and so forth. And I visited 19 different archives in the United States and Canada, looking through a lot of times their ephemera collections, so like just random loose flyers. I went through thousands of feminist periodicals, and this was before a lot of them were digitized and OSR readable. So I couldn't just Control F. I had to flip through like literally all the pages, looking at articles and advertisement sections. I also contacted basically every LGBTQ plus and feminist archive in the US and Canada that I found at the time, from the Lavender Legacies directory. And I also went through travel guides. So there used to be these lesbian travel guides. Oh, sorry, here's some examples of some of the stuff you could find in these collections. There were also some boxes that actually were specific to a restaurant or coffee house. So this is a woman's coffee house in Minneapolis at the Treader, and you can see intake forms they had, past memberships, flyers for concerts, and just like notes of like what people needed to do before events. Here's a list of some of the archives and collections that I looked at. And I also later, because no one had really updated the Society of American Archivists Lavender Legacies page in quite a long time. So I recently released a new directory that's updated. And so for a local archival highlight, so the website is lgbtqarchives.com. It's just really a simple kind of directory. You can find archives in your area, as well as different collections and projects. But I want to highlight some, they're not technically queer archives themselves, but they're special collections and projects that are happening in New Jersey. Okay. So the other thing I looked at were these travel guides. So Guy's Guide or Gay's Guide was a woman's travel guide, which so it was really kind of, again, this kind of coded for like lesbian guide that showed where there were feminist spaces and lesbian spaces, bars, restaurants, clubs, bookstores for people traveling around. There's also kind of a larger body of work on the Dameron's gay travel guide. And I sometimes found spaces in that. So I looked through every edition of Guy's Guide, basically, as well as many of the Dameron's guides to kind of find these spaces. And so that's why when I say in the directory, you can't always know 100% if a space was feminist, is because sometimes all I have is one listing in a travel guide one time, or one random business card in an ephemera collection. For places like Bloodroot or Mid Courage, where there's actually archival boxes filled with material, or for places where I could actually interview people. So I would go on different Facebook groups. There's these remembrance groups for some of these restaurants, and I asked to join and identified myself as a researcher, as well as through snowball interviewing, where I'd interview someone and they would connect me to someone else. And then I also put my directory really early, my initial one from 2013, on the website, thefeministrestaurantproject.com, and shared it around and asked people to let me know of places I was missing. And that's also how I found some interviews. So yeah, so you can kind of see some of the initial directory and mapping. I had a more complicated map at one point and people weren't that interested in it. I'm not going to talk about that in more detail now, but there's now some, I've given my additions of the Gaia's Guide that I was able to source because I couldn't find a complete collection in any archive or place. And sometimes I could track them down in old bookstores. And so there's now a new project that's actually mapping the entire Gaia's Guides. So, which is exciting and much better mapping than I was doing in 2013, 2012. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up for the next couple of minutes talking about what happened after 1989. I want to be attentive to our time. And then we can talk more about anything that I've mentioned in the Q&A. So I stopped the kind of initial work that I was doing in my doctoral research after 1989, because some of them still were kind of operating into the early 90s, but you kind of see in part as a reaction to post-feminist movements, in part as a reaction to just changes in the economy, in part as a reaction to changes in feminist movements overall. There's kind of a lot of factors of why there were less feminist restaurants started after 1989, and many of them closed. Also, just, even though Bloodroot's been around for 47 years, that's a really long time for a restaurant. Most restaurants don't make it a year, whether they're feminist or not. It's a really hard industry. So as people got tired, sometimes people sold the space, sometimes people closed it. There are a lot of different economic factors of why people close these spaces. But after 1989, we start to see kind of like a significant decrease in the number that are founded. But then we really have there's a few kind of founded here and there in the 90s and early 2000s, but there's a huge resurgence of feminist restaurants around kind of 2015, 2016, linked to the rise of Trumpism. So there's a few reasons why I see this is happening. Part of it has to do with, while there are a lot of restaurants that are being founded with social justice principles, with feminist principles in mind, people weren't really using the term as explicitly, but maybe enacting some of these feminist principles in their work already. Around when there's kind of the rise of Trumpism, people feel re-energized and that there's a lot of importance in specifically naming something as feminist. You see a rise of feminist bookstores at this time as well. We also see economic changes that kind of allow for the resurgence of independent bookstores. And that's really important for this history because many of the spaces that are founded in kind of the mid-20 teens tend to be like bookstores / cafes or multi-revenue restaurants. So that way they kind of had a bit more stability. But these restaurants take on a bit of a different tone. Is a new generation of founders, and feminist principles have continued to change and evolve and adapt. There's a lot more emphasis on queer over lesbian identity, and this isn't to disparage lesbian identity, it's very important, but just in terms of who was founding these spaces, many of the people starting them identified primarily as queer. There are a lot more women and people of color involved in them, and most of them are very explicitly trans inclusive. So here's some images of some of these post-1989 spaces. So you can see Blue Stockings in New York, that was actually founded in the 90s. You can see a seat at the table books. You can see Augusta with her dog in front of her chocolate shop. She has the mitzvah wall where people can kind of pay it forward for people to get drinks or coffee, like chocolates and so forth. There's Cafe Con Libros, there's Fulton Books, etc. And one thing that I hadn't really emphasized, because I went through the mapping section quite quickly, is that feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses were distributed across the United States. Basically, every state besides North Dakota had one, and maybe there was one in North Dakota, but I just never learned about it. And this is really important because it shifts a lot of the narratives that we have around where activism was happening, as well as where like feminist activism and queer activism was happening, because a lot of times the emphasis is really on kind of like New York and then kind of California. So some kind of key findings that I want to wrap up on is that these restaurants show the importance of feminist-centered and LGBTQ-centered space for fostering community, for fostering economic and artistic movements. That triangle really shows the challenge of running a feminist business, whether it's a restaurant or not, trying to be attentive to where you're getting your materials from, the people working in the space, and also making it accessible for different clients or customers or community can be really challenging. These spaces contributed to literary culture. I didn't talk about in presentation, but can later, also how social media has kind of shifted some of this. But also, these spaces have a really long-lasting legacy, and we can see how a lot of the work that the founders did in the 70s and 80s and beyond has influenced both restaurant culture and feminist business and feminist movements beyond. So I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. Here's my contact information. I'm going to leave the screen sharing up just so that we can still have captions for people in attendance as the Zoom captions weren't working. So thank you so much, and I'm excited to chat with y'all.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Ketchum. That was really amazing. So I'm going to start with a question I have, and then I will move into questions from the audience. Again, if you have any questions, you could just put them in the Q&A box, and then we'll read them out. So, something you talked about and is part of the book is how these spaces, the restaurants, were spaces for lesbian culture, right? You talked about the books and the music and the art. So my question for you is, do physical spaces that serve the same role as these restaurants for lesbian culture exist for lesbian and queer culture today? And then is there something different between lesbian queer spaces that exist in person versus virtually?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that question. So in terms of spaces existing today, as I mentioned, there's been kind of a shift, sometimes around terminology. So we see a lot of queer spaces, but we also still see lesbian spaces. So a lot of folks really love to talk about the disappearance of the lesbian bar, though I think actually some of that conversation has led to a resurgence of lesbian bars. So if you look at the Lesbian Bar Project, for example, you see there's kind of like a dying off, though I don't really like using that terminology, but there's kind of like a dying off. There's a lot fewer lesbian bars, but now we're starting to see a resurgence of bars marking themselves as lesbian. But there's quite a lot of different kinds of queer spaces, queer restaurants, bookstores, community centers, and so forth. We see kind of ebbs and flows of when people find it important to have community-centered space and when kind of feeling accepted by the larger public and being able to go everywhere is seen as more important. And so that kind of can map onto certain things in our political histories, right? So right now, as we're seeing kind of a lot of anti-trans language and anti-LGBTQ language, like a lot of homophobia kind of resurgence, we're also seeing, again, like a pushback within queer culture, like the importance of these spaces. So there are spaces that exist today and continue to be founded. There's also, in terms of the difference between physical and virtual space. So there's a few different folks kind of within communication studies and such that really kind of push back on, and like activists that push back on this binary separation of this kind of away from keyboard versus like our meat sack, right? Like the cyberspace versus the meat space. You've heard different terminology over the years. The meat space is really like 1980s, 1990s. But in that, like, we actually are bringing ourselves to all these different spaces, but I think many of us feel that we get different things out of these communities. So virtual spaces can be amazing to connect with folks from across the world. If you're feeling very isolated where you live, it can be a great way to connect to community, but there is also a lot of value in having a place to gather. But one of the challenges with having physical space is sometimes those kind of economic barriers with rents increasing in many different cities, for example, not to just be urban centric, but that can create limitations of having permanent spaces. But that's why we see kind of a lot of pop-up events and community events as well. So I think there's value to both. It's not that one is better than other. Virtual spaces can also allow for a lot of accessibility for folks who have caregiving responsibilities, people with different disabilities, and so forth. So I think it's actually beautiful that we're able to have this mixture of the different kinds of spaces.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So you kind of started to parse out how people in the 70s and 80s were defining feminist food. So my question for you, is there such a thing as feminist food today? And how would you define it if that is possible?
Yeah, for sure. I think feminist food today kind of continues a lot of that legacy, but we actually see a move with people who are defining it, we see kind of a move as we did even in the 70s, away from like one type of kind of vegetarianism to more veganism. So when Butter started, their initial cookbook even has some fish recipes because in the kind of 1970s vegetarianism, fish was sometimes included. And then there's been kind of a move to a lot of critique of the kind of industrial farming as a whole, especially with animal husbandry. So we see a move towards veganism. We also see a lot of kind of intersections between feminist food and queer food interacting too. I recently hosted a conference on queer food, and we released a cookbook as well that's free. I'm not trying to like push people to buy anything. It's free online. As is my book, actually. It's available open access. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of discussions around the sourcing of the products. And then there's also more discussions today around ideas of cultural appropriation with food, which sometimes can be quite contentious, as food ingredients have always been shared across cultures, but there's a difference of when someone is making money from it that kind of comes into play. So, for example, are people cooking food from other cultures and making money from it when people from that culture aren't able to? So I think those are kind of the changing discussions around feminist food, in terms of, like, again, sourcing of products and then also cultural appropriation.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so this is a question from our Q&A. I was wondering if you found any info in your research regarding how these restaurants engaged with international politics. For example, the boycotts of El Salvador grown coffee, and or specifically buying Sandinista affiliated coffee during the 1980s, boycotting South African food products, or boycotting food products on the BDS list. So how does the idea of feminist food engage with the international politics of the left?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So yes, quickly, yes, although a lot of them were really focused kind of like on kind of American farm workers movements and like kind of Galo crepes and stuff like that. But especially especially ones founded a bit later, like in the 90s and beyond, there's a lot more discussion kind of around the sourcing of coffee and chocolate. And then for the feminist restaurants that operate today, there is definitely a discussion that's happening online on their Instagrams and so forth around BDS movements, and like where their money is going and who they're supporting. So for example, if you want someone who really explicitly talks about these things, especially with the sourcing of chocolate and like the role of like modern day slavery and chocolate, Augusta Yearwood writes a lot about this, both in her cookbook and as well on her social media pages. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so I have one more question for you, Dr. Ketchum. So, I read this book and I really loved it. And there were, and beyond, just the important historiographical contributions, there were a lot of really great stories about these places and the people who founded them. So I was just wondering if there were any stories that you wanted to share that didn't make it into the book.
For sure. So actually, I mentioned this briefly in my presentation, but my initial project that I worked on for a long time was actually the US and Canada. And I cut off Canada out because it meant that I had to explain a lot of different tax structure and tax law, which I don't think is people's favorite part of the book. I try to keep it brief in the book, though. It's amazing how important 501c3 and 501c7 status is to the operating of these spaces. But for folks who don't know, that's nonprofit codes, and C7 is for a nonprofit club where you can sell memberships. But I didn't want to spend a lot of time having to explain the difference of municipal, federal, state, provincial laws. My dog just walked in the background. Hi, Sprout. And so because of that, I ended up cutting out Canada. But there's a really interesting story of something that happened in Toronto. So a group of women really wanted to start a space in Toronto. They're affiliated with LUTE, which was the Lesbian Organization of Toronto. And they wanted to start this business that had multiple floors. One would have a restaurant, one would have a bar, it would have a barber shop, it would have a space for dancing. And they basically bought an old frat house close to one of the university campuses. It had like awful orange paint all over the walls, and they're really excited to start this space. But they found out after they got the property that was zoned incorrectly. And zoning issues were an ongoing challenge for a lot of these spaces, especially for the ones starting earlier on, because many of the people who started these spaces hadn't had restaurant experience and they didn't have experience running a business. So there were some kind of like mistakes that happened for the ones starting earlier, and then kind of ones founded later got to learn from the earlier founders. But so it wasn't zoned properly and they were never able to open it, which was very sad. They were going to name it Clementines, and it sounds like it would have been an amazing space. But a few of the founders got so fed up, they ended up moving to Brazil. And there are just funds for the initial space just sitting there. So a few other folks in Toronto took those funds and started a feminist coffee house called the Three of Cups that was really involved in bringing musicians from the women's music movement, connecting kind of the activist community with work that was happening at the University of Toronto. And yeah, and it existed for quite a few years. So I really like that story because sometimes we saw spaces that started out as coffee houses with the dream of becoming a restaurant, but sometimes spaces like transformed back and forth. And so I really enjoy that story for its adaptability, its resilience, and the way that people really were dreaming so big initially.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. That is really interesting. Awesome. Well, if there is no more questions for the Q&A, we can wrap up for today. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for our Champions of Equality Lunch and Learn. If you enjoyed today's program and would like to continue helping us highlight important voices in the fight for gender equality, please consider making a donation at alicepaul.org. And before we sign out for the day, I just want to let you all know about some upcoming programs we have going on here at Paulsdale. So on June 15th from 10 to 3 p.m., on site here at Paulsdale, the Yellow Roses will be joining us at Paulsdale for a suffrage story time and crafts. That's June 15th from 10 to 3. And then August 24th from 12 to 3 is our annual Women's Equality Day Festival. So at that, we will have local vendors, a beer garden, live music, and we're also going to have food trucks owned by women related to this topic we've been talking about today. So you can find more information about these programs and other things we have going on at alicepaul.org. Thank you again to Dr. Ketchum for joining us, and thank you everyone else, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And you can find links to all my work at those links. So thank you. Bye.